You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. We've got a loaded show for you today with a guest checking in who arrives at a timely juncture to help us talk through climate policy and the role of business in the energy transition. From there, we'll join Geoff in the strategy suite to talk about carbon tax and nominations. And we've got a clipping on the Haida land agreement. From there, we'll go to the minibar. So we'll see Geoff shortly in the strategy suite. In the meantime, Mike, I wanted to check in and see if you had anything you wanted to say to our listeners in Kingfisher.
I do. It's a major mea culpa. Last week, I questioned the existence of Kingfisher, British Columbia, which I'd never heard of before. And I'm supposed to be Encyclopedia Mike here.
You are.
When it comes to British Columbia. And a listener by the name of Joel texted me and said, yeah, I know where Kingfisher is. And the worst thing is Joel's from Calgary. So to have someone from Calgary correct me on BC geography is humiliating, to say the least. It's almost as bad as following someone with Alberta license plates on the highway. You know. But,
congratulations, Joel. That doesn't happen often. Yeah.
But thank you, Joel, for correcting me, and I will never make another factual mistake again on Hotel Pacifico. But that, but I also want to mention my epic Easter walk, Kate.
Okay. Wow.
On Sunday, I had the bright idea with my older daughter to walk to see my mother, who lives in Burnaby.
Burnaby, right?
And I was starting from Kitsilano, and I walked to Burnaby Mountain. And I must say, it was, I don't know if I'd recommend it to everybody, but it was fascinating to walk through so many neighborhoods in Vancouver and Burnaby and just see things that you don't normally see. You know, we went underneath the Second Narrows Bridge, or Ironworkers Bridge, and along the North Burnaby. And yeah, Burnaby, I'm going to say it for Burnaby. I should have saved this for the minibar, but I'm raising an early glass to Burnaby for a lot of the parks and the green space in North Burnaby. So I'm now official booster of North Burnaby Tourism Bureau. But ran into a farmer's market at the P&E and all sorts of great things, just walking around our city, walking around our region. So that was my Easter fun. But I did not make it as far as the Shell terminal in North Burnaby. I did make it to the Parkland refinery. I walked right along there, which had a little problem recently. But I did not make it to the Shell terminal. So my apologies to our guest today, Susannah Pierce, who is the Shell Canada president and country chair in Canada, and also had the distinction, she's had many distinctions, but one of her distinctions is Business Leader of the Year, Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Susannah, welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
Welcome.
Hey, Mike, thanks so much. It's good to be here. And next time, Mike, when you're in Burnaby and you want to go by the Shell terminal, just let me know. Give me a buzz. It's actually, it's quite interesting to go down there, go to the water, and just understand how product gets moved. And by the way, that refinery we sold to Parkland some years ago. And
oh, well, I didn't even know I was
you are
a former Shell refinery. It's a massive facility. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
But next time I'll walk further. That's for sure. Did not walk far enough. But
did you make it in time for dinner? Let me just ask that. You got in time for dinner, for Easter dinner at least?
Yes. And I also made time for happy hour too, so it was good. But so your country chair, what is country chair? How does that work within Shell? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question because I get asked this quite a bit. So there's the president and country chair, and the country chair, boy, we have them all across the world, frankly, for Shell, where we have business. Sometimes you have country chairs that cover multiple countries, depending upon the investments that we have in the region. But really what you're responsible for is coordinating the businesses within a particular region or country, because each of our businesses within Shell, and when you think about Shell, you might just think about the gas station, but Shell is also what we call an integrated energy company, which means we do everything from oil and gas exploration to refining to distribution, sending it out through the stations that you see with our Shell logo, to things like integrated gas that we're going to get into, I'm sure, at some point today, which includes LNG, hydrogen, things like that. So as country chair, when we look across all of our existing businesses or new business development, I'm responsible for really bringing it all together so we have a cohesive country plan, as opposed to just all these businesses in the country reporting out to our headquarters in London.
How many companies is that in Canada?
Well, I mean, there's dozens, at the end of the day, because we all have independent companies that roll up into Shell Canada Limited. However, when we think of the actual lines of business, I would say that we have approximately, I'll just say 6, which includes our chemicals and products, which is how we refine and then create products that you use, airlines use, cars use, et cetera. Everything from our integrated gas business, which is about how do we produce natural gas and then how do we liquefy it and ship it out. Everything from mobility, which is again is the stations that you see where we sell fuels, where we also sell lubricants, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say probably 6 big ones, and then the developing businesses and things like carbon capture sequestration and hydrogen.
How did you get here? Like, what was your path to becoming country chair?
Yeah.
Was it something you always, energy sector, something you always had a passion for, or did you kind of fall into it?
That's really interesting, Mike, because I grew up in Alberta, and when I grew up in Alberta, the last thing I wanted to do is work in oil and gas. And part of the reason for that is because that's what everybody did. And I did not want to do that. And so when I was 18, I left Alberta. I went down to the United States. I actually went to school in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to become an international correspondent of all things. So I was studying journalism, and I wanted to actually become a correspondent in war zones or travel the world and really do stories about developing countries. I then went on while I was studying in Washington to say, well, maybe I want to do more than just report on it. Maybe I want to get actively involved in development of projects in countries like this. So I went to a graduate school called Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And at the time in the mid-90s, they had a degree in environment, energy, science, and technology, which was really a really interesting combination of how do we look at development of energy systems along with impact on the environment, what's the role of science and technology. And really quite fascinatingly, and this was mid-90s, we had just signed, or about to sign Kyoto, I became much more interested in those intersections. And so not to say that I ever thought that I'd have the job I do today, which is frankly all about those intersections. It kind of really opened my eyes to looking at energy in a different way. And there's a long circuitous path from that point in graduate school to where I am today. But that kind of brought me back to, maybe there's something more interesting here in the energy field.
Well,
and then eventually I found myself here. Yeah.
Was it undergrad when you interned with, it was a New York Congresswoman, was it Louise Slaughter?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, how did that happen? And tell us about that.
Well, it was really kind of interesting. Being in Washington, D.C., I go back and I think, wow, did I really do that? You basically are going to school in a place where your professors are people who are either Pulitzer Prize winners if you're a journalist, or Hillary Rodham Clinton was somebody who we interacted with because she was the one who was part of the program I was involved with. And so you have a lot of interaction with people, on a day-to-day basis, either in school or outside of school where you can intern. And part of what you could do in Washington, D.C. is intern. And so I ended up interning on Capitol Hill with Congresswoman Louise Slaughter. And I was actually in the press department there. And, it was interesting. So I was responsible for helping to manage the press and then press releases and all of this. But I can remember being up there in the halls of Congress, walking around and going, so pretty much Congress is run by young people. Like you see the Congress people and you think some of them are, getting on in years. But when you actually see the people working in the halls of Congress, many of them are very young people who are just like, we're there. We're here to give. We're here to learn. We're here to be a part of this. And it's pretty exciting, actually.
Are you still in touch? Like, were there, 2 questions on that. Are there any other Canadians you ran into in the process of that? And then are you still in touch with anyone from that era?
Well, good question. I don't remember a lot of Canadians back then, but kind of a long story short, the person who ended up hiring me into Shell was somebody I knew who used to work for the senior Senator Murkowski, who was from Alaska. And back in those days, Canada was part of something called the Alaska Natural Gas Transportation Act. Or part of this was to build a pipeline all the way from Alaska through Canada into the United States to bring oil and natural gas. And so in this case, it was a natural gas piece. Yeah, I was involved with having conversations with that office. And lo and behold, that's the guy who eventually hired me into Shell. So yeah, I still keep in contact with all those people. And increasingly, I think we are looking at doing more integration work between Canada and the United States, and I'll do more of it.
I think you could say the same about Canada in terms of young people running the joint, both at the House of Commons and BC Legislature for sure.
Well, you give up so much of your life, as you know. I mean, it's a 24/7 gig. You can get called at any point in time. It's very purposeful too, because you're really involved in having an impact on policy and legislation that impacts all of us. So it's pretty critically important, and it's quite the experience.
Was it your experience too? I mean, I think one of my fondest memories of that work is there's a lot of opportunity, like stuff just gets lobbed at you and you just have to figure it out. Compared to sort of, especially the corporate sector, which tends to be more like you kind of work your way up and you learn your pieces. I found in politics, it's just, shit's blowing up, figure it out. Can you solve it? Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, you know, yeah, you kind of have to have that mentality regardless, a little bit of that mindset. Like you're getting thrown, like even in this role too, there's stuff happening all the time. And especially in a very activist policy environment we find ourselves in today in the energy sector, you've got to really understand, okay, how do we work with this? Or what is the role of this particular energy product in this system? And given the geopolitics today, yeah, you've got to have a mindset of, okay, I've just been handed this big clump of whatever. What are we going to do about it? Or how do we actively try to find this workable solution, especially when we think about the energy transition?
Well, speaking of the energy transition, that intersection that you referred to, paint us a picture of 2050. Like, yeah. What's the world going to look like 25 years from now? What do you think? Energy-wise, anyways.
Well, you know, that's really predicting what it's going to look like in 2050. Again, I know one thing for sure, I'm going to be completely wrong. But I do think if we look at where generally we're seeing the world is going, I think there is an acknowledgement that we're having an impact on the climate with the use of unabated fossil fuels that create emissions, or things that create emissions. I mean, we could even say agriculture does. So we do need to take a look at what is the impact of the emissions that are going into the atmosphere that are not effectively being absorbed, being absorbed by nature, for example. So how do we write that balance? And I think that there is a commitment and an understanding to do that. And even in just the last 5 years, you've seen the transition between companies that didn't have commitments on climate to companies now that do, shareholders that are expecting more of companies, disclosures, countries as well. And so you've got the commitment out there. But at the same time, I think what we're realizing today is it's not as easy as we thought to change an energy system that took generations to build. And when you think about the dependency we have today on oil and gas, for example, changing that is not easy, because you've got the full value chain you need to think about. People who use energy and oil and gas to fly planes, drive cars, manage equipment, move goods and products, to people who produce it. And so you need to be able to look across that entire value chain and figure out how do you do that and change that in such a way that you minimize the amount of disruption, both in terms of energy security, but also economic challenges with that. I mean, I don't think it is okay that we say we're going to shut down this energy system and then all of a sudden people don't have it or it's too expensive. So what I think we're seeing is by 2050, we will have worked out that there isn't just one silver bullet. It isn't all about electrification, because we know electrification is one energy source. It's not perfect for everything. There will be a role for oil and gas. There will be a role for technologies that capture carbon, whether they're nature or other, nature-based systems or technology like carbon capture sequestration. And there could be a whole bunch of other solutions involved. But by 2050, I think you will see that we have collectively looked at how do we decarbonize the economy in a way that is protecting some of these things that we care about. Energy security, it's available to us, it's reliable, and affordability. And then how that plays into the transition, I think, will determine what we look like in 2050.
Federal government's pretty hot to trot on hydrogen. Yeah. Where do you see the hydrogen file shaping up?
So the hydrogen file is interesting. Like hydrogen's been a part of, business for some time. We use hydrogen when we're looking at refining products that we then put into cars and planes and trains and things like that. What we're now looking at is using hydrogen for other uses. We still see quite a bit of use of hydrogen in the industrial sector, hard to abate sectors that can easily electrify. We've looked at in Shell hydrogen for light duty transportation, like for your Toyota Mirais and things like that. We are less hot on that particular use of it, simply because you have to change quite a lot of the system. You have to make sure that car manufacturers are manufacturing the cars. You've got to be able to put the hydrogen in your stations, et cetera. We still see hydrogen, again, mostly in the industrial sector, maybe in medium heavy duty trucking where it's longer haul and you have less infrastructure to rebuild. But there is the role today, and I think there will definitely be a role in the future. And the question is, how do you make sure that the hydrogen is low carbon hydrogen, and again, is an affordable alternative?
Guess, I love a good plot twist. And not just for the thrill of being surprised. Because a good plot twist does more than surprise you. It makes you rethink everything that came before. You can rewatch The Usual Suspects, Get Out, Gone Girl, or The Sixth Sense, and rethink every scene you thought you understood the first time around. Anything that makes you rethink something you thought you already knew is powerful and absolutely worth doing. That's the power of Carol Ann Hilton's Indigenomics. It really should be mandatory reading. There are many reasons to read that book, but above all, it will make you rethink the things you think you know about our relationship to money, land, resources, and the economy. Hilton is the founder of the Indigenomics Institute, which invites governments, corporations, and individuals to reimagine the global economy with Indigenous worldviews and perspectives. The events put on by the Indigenomics Institute provide opportunities for attendees to learn how their reconciliation efforts can elevate the role of Indigenous peoples in business through meaningful dialogue and connection. TELUS is a multi-year partner with the Institute, and TELUS leaders have presented at and participated in many of their events. Partnering with Indigenous-led organizations is a key pillar of TELUS's Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan. They're also including Indigenous peoples in strategic initiatives, including delivering advanced broadband connectivity and reevaluating employment and procurement practices in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's Call to Action, number 92. Everyone needs modern connectivity to thrive in today's world. And in economic reconciliation, connectivity is the best kind of plot twist, the kind that ensures Indigenous people have equitable access to education, career opportunities, social and health services. To learn more about the Indigenomics Institute and maybe rethink some of what you think you already know, check out their LinkedIn or indigenomicsinstitute.com. Well, I think I was reading something, a sort of a piece with you quoted in it recently, talking about this transition and sort of whose responsibility is what. And I think the point you were making was that like business in the oil and gas sector in particular can't do this alone, that the whole economy has to shift together. I have a few layers to this question, but can I maybe just give you the chance to explain that more deeply, what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, maybe let me use this hydrogen question as an example. So many of us will fly into YVR. And when we're coming out of YVR, we'll pass a Shell station as we're going down Granville if you're heading downtown. Mm-hmm. And the Shell station on the right, if you look, you'll see a hydrogen pump. Now, typically, the many times I've gone past that station, I have never once seen somebody filling up their car at that hydrogen pump. So we've taken space that would otherwise be used to sell gasoline for hydrogen. And the unfortunate thing is that space is actually not necessarily selling the same amount of fuel as the other pump is. And so we've made the investment, but the customers aren't buying, is what I'm trying to say. So is it wise for companies to make investments if customers aren't buying the product? And so this is why we have to take a look at a system. How do we incentivize both customer demand and production, and then the infrastructure pieces in between so we can provide that energy? And that's why it's a much more systemic approach. I think we're getting a lot smarter on it. And I think what we're trying to do, we collectively as industry and government, has said, okay, well, we get that. We have to look at things on a systemic basis. So let's really try to design that in such a way that the incentives are in the right place, the regulatory measures in the right place, and that you can actually see the transition happen more effectively. So you don't have stranded pieces of infrastructure because customers aren't buying. That's not what we want, because you won't make those investments. So that's what I mean by that. And, you know, as a company, especially companies that depend upon shareholder dollars or investors, you can't say to your investors, okay, give me $1, I'll give you nothing in return. Well, then you wouldn't be a company for very long. You need to create the investment case. An investor will say, oh, if I give you that $1, I'll give you $1.50 back. Okay, that makes sense. So these are the decisions we need to make. And as a company, that will be dependent upon where customers, you know, want to go with us.
So, yeah, so you're talking about there's a sort of coordination that has to happen across industries and across the economy for this to work. And I guess I'm not putting words in your mouth to say like the government clearly plays some role in that. Okay, yeah, and that coordination. So then I think then to go deeper with that, like the role of government in this, because I think you also talked a little bit about like, okay, then you've got these levers, you've got incentives, you've got regulation, right? And I'm curious, you know, what do you see? And we're talking, I have to name it, we're talking the day after the latest hike on the tax of carbon. Like it just kind of brings me to say, like, when you look at tools like that, like, are you saying there's a role for that? Like, what is the way for government to cohesively coordinate all this and push this behemoth, together?
Yeah. So I think we always, and I think this is the case, so what do companies want? They would like consistency and reliable policy. So policy that we can predict and build into our business plans. Policy that jumps around creates investor uncertainty. And so as a company, you want to know, okay, this policy is happening, it's going to be in place, and I can predict over time where it's going. So this is from a company's perspective. I can get to a consumer in a minute. So from a company's perspective, when we look at things like the carbon tax, if we know the carbon tax is going a certain direction over time, we then have choices to make in terms of what can we do to avoid that carbon tax, because that's a penalty, right? Okay, well, if we can find it's cheaper to invest in carbon capture sequestration, maybe we do that so we capture emissions instead of emitting them and being charged that carbon price. So policy creates if it's consistent policy, it gives us the signals to make certain investment decisions. That's what's important on that. So there is a role for things like carbon tax if we are wanting to make sure that we're reducing the amount of carbon we emit, and there are alternatives. This is the important thing to know. If you have a carbon tax, but there's no alternatives to companies to reduce but to pay that carbon tax, there'll become a point where that carbon tax is so expensive, companies will stop producing. And that's something that we need to be mindful of. Is there in that scale of options something that's cheaper that allows the company to continue to produce instead of just saying, well, I can't produce because there's no alternatives that are cheaper than paying the carbon tax. So that's what we look at. We look at consistent policy. We also give feedback to government too and say, well, if you look at that carbon tax, if there's a whole host of technical options that we can employ that are cheaper than that, and that enables us to continue to produce, let's talk about what that looks like. But if those technical options are not cheaper or they need more incentives, that's when the role of incentives come in. So if you look at, for example, in carbon capture sequestration, we're still waiting on the ITC, which is the incentive tax credit. That will help reduce the cost of carbon capture sequestration, again, so that it becomes a much better option for us to invest in to reduce the amount of carbon avoidance tax. Yeah, the business case, essentially. So that's what we look at, consistent policy. When it comes to consumers, we also have to be very mindful of what is the impact on consumers, however. It's one thing for us to essentially say, well, it's cheaper for us to invest in this technology than pay $170 carbon tax. But if we're passing that on to consumers where they're paying more, there's also this problem. Well, they may not buy those products anymore. And that has an impact on them, particularly when those products are things that they depend on for their livelihoods. And we all depend on energy for our livelihoods, whether it's the electricity we turn on, whether it's the car that we drive, the products that move our food from the farm to the grocery store. Like, energy is so connected in everything that we do that we actually have to be really paying attention. If we have an impact on the cost of energy, it does have an impact on consumers. How are we managing through that value chain?
So on climate commitments, you're obviously, Shell's a huge company and almost like a nation state to itself. It's so big, I would imagine. You're obviously working with climate policies out here in Canada and countries all over the world. Does Shell itself have its own climate commitment that it's trying to meet, or are you just meeting those through the countries that you operate in?
Well, that's a really, actually, very intelligent question, Mike, because you could just say, you could just say, hey, you've just got to meet whatever commitment you have at a country level. But as a company that's a global company, what we have is a global commitment to net zero by 2050. And then how we meet that net zero commitment is going to be a factor of looking across all of the various options we have globally in terms of reducing emissions that might offset the increase of emissions in one location, or investing in technology over here, carbon capture sequestration, seem to be talking about that a lot today, that can remove emissions, which enable us to continue to production over here as we get to net zero. So we have a global commitment to net zero by 2050, and we look across the entire asset base that we have today and future assets that we will be creating to say, okay, now how do we meet that?
So we have a Ziploc bag freezer container metaphor I think we have to come back to, Mike.
Yes.
I'll explain that in a second, Susannah, but I wanted to ask, because I think, if you put that lens on Shell globally, Shell has actually backed off of a promise to reduce oil and gas production, by a couple percentages each year. So can you help me understand, like, where does that portrait come together, and that sort of global portrait? Yeah.
Yeah, so just on the reducing oil production, I think it's not just oil and gas, it was really just oil production 2% per year. So that was a commitment we made under our strategy called Powering Progress that came out in 2021. And that was a commitment that we would reduce 2% per year by 2030. So believe it or not, it's 2024. We already made that commitment. So we've already actually matched the amount of oil production we need to reduce already. So when you hear us continue to invest in oil, what essentially we're doing is we're investing in oil to keep production at the same level, because we've already made that commitment. So it's not that we've come back off of it. We actually already met it. And so therefore, you still are going to have to produce oil to meet that plateau or that flat line. So we're not increasing oil production, it's sustained because we already made that commitment to 2030. When it comes to natural gas, however, and LNG, that's a bit of a different story, because we actually do see such a role for natural gas continually, and LNG in particular, because when you look at getting off of things like coal, if you look at the use of things like natural gas in hard to abate sectors, or essentially in sectors that require a lot of high heat applications, there still is quite a bit of role for natural gas. So industrial boilers, for example. So we think that there's still a role for natural gas, and in particular LNG, as you look at moving natural gas across the world to locations that wouldn't otherwise have access to it domestically or via pipelines. So long way coming back to what you said, we've already made that oil commitment. We continue to invest to keep it at pretty much at a flat line to 2030. And natural gas and LNG, we do see quite a demand going forward to about 2040.
What was the 2030 commitment informed by? Like, what's this level you're at now?
Oh, okay, so the 2030 commitment was informed by climate targets to 2030. And so we said in 2021, we would reduce oil production 2% per year. Well, because of divestments, we've already done that. And so now it's basically a plateau.
Let's talk a little bit more then, because I do want to explain the Ziploc freezer bag metaphor, because it relates to this, and it goes back to actually a conversation we had with Mike's former boss, former Premier Christy Clark, and she was sort of lamenting, like, you can't think about climate policy and emissions in sort of Canada contained, because we don't exist within a Ziploc bag, and this is where we got. Yeah. Sorry, our metaphors tend to run away here, and we did get to sort of the global atmosphere as being a freezer bag. And so I'm wondering, when we talk about LNG specifically, is that sort of the, you're moving to the freezer bag calculus when you talk about that, i.e., if you look at a project like LNG in terms of the emissions it causes for Canada, you can look at it as a net loss globally in the context of if it's removing coal in another economy somewhere else. Is that sort of, am I following that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, on that, I mean, that's what Article 6
exactly.
was meant to speak to, if I'm correct, right? Like,
yes.
And is that ever going to happen, Susannah? Like,
sorry, Article 6 within the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
Well, like in terms of being implemented, and I'm a little foggy on how this all works, but I mean that it's talked about a bit.
Well, yes,
Canada can get credit for helping other countries.
Correct. Well, and this is the interesting thing about agreements, international agreements, and these are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So, in other words, if I am able to reduce emissions in another country through the application of technology or displacement of something higher emitting, then whatever that reduction is, that other country, will that other country send me that unit back, that credit back to my own ledger? So Canada has its nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Let's say China has theirs under the Paris Agreement. And then we're able to send a certain amount of product, LNG, that displaces a certain amount of emissions by displacing coal. Then whatever those amounts of emissions are, will China send us a credit back that we can then use on our own ledger against our nationally determined contribution? Now, that's how it's supposed to work in practice, this transfer, this trade. And this is a really important concept, because the entire Paris Agreement and international agreements, or the role of trade, is something that we don't actually talk a lot about. Because successful climate policy is one that actually, I think, leverages the market to make it actually work. In other words, what are the incentive structures that make it worthwhile for me to invest in a carbon abatement project to offset the emissions? And this is something where we don't have systems that are communicating with each other effectively, right? So you can look at that from an international basis. But even I would say in Canada, we don't do this at all, and we should, which is if it's more effective for me, because you've got basically better reservoir, you have the policy in place for me to essentially invest in a carbon reduction project, let's say in Alberta, carbon capture sequestration, and I remove, let's say, 2 million tons per year there. Why can't BC and Alberta trade that? because if Alberta and BC is exporting a lot of LNG, why not the emissions that come up from that production be offset by the emissions in Alberta? Problem is, we don't actually allow that to happen in our own country, let alone internationally, which is a real miss.
I'm having a flashback. I'm having a flashback to the Pacific Carbon Trust.
Well, you should actually.
Which was a similar idea, which basically collapsed because it was seen as corporate subsidy or something like along those lines.
Well, and I think that it comes down to the fact, how do you measure it? And how do you ensure that these are verifiable emissions reductions? Well, you can, especially with technology today, you can actually do that. The thing really where I think the biggest challenge is the political incentive. It's the incentive to do that. How do we actually make these trades work effectively and build confidence? And I think this is a really part of the missing discussion. We want to meet our climate commitments. But to really do this in such a way that we protect the affordability aspect of this, we should be looking at the lowest cost abatement opportunities and enabling that trade. If it's more expensive for me to reduce my emissions by doing this here, well, then why would I look for a lower cost option to do it over there? So this is what we're not having a good conversation about. And that's something that I think we really need to pick up both domestically, but then also internationally.
Right.
Well, do you have a view, like, because I think, in talking about this, I completely agree. Like, there needs to be a point where the market needs to push on this, right? And you basically need to kind of take all these pieces together to create that context. And I think there's a bit of a question underneath that, if there's going to be incentives involved at some level. And so how do we fund the incentives, I guess? Like,
yeah.
Right.
You're asking a really good question as well, because people think, well, not people, that's a generalization. When we want to pay for things in society, or we want government to pay for things, the money has to come from somewhere. So the money can come from taxpayers, where we essentially just continue to give a certain amount of money that we earn and we give it to the government to spend for us. But the money also comes from major capital investments and investments in our country that then generate royalties and taxes. We're missing that piece where there actually is this positive relationship between driving investment that generate a certain amount of royalties and taxes to government, which then they can then recycle back into decarbonization. This is where, there is this piece where we need investments. We need taxes from those investments that then can be generative into some of the new and clean technologies that are not necessarily economic or commercialized today. That's where the money, I think, can come from. So we can't just say stop it all now, because we need the investment to generate those earnings to government to spend the money, because you can't just keep putting it onto the taxpayers like you and me. And that's the piece of the pie we're missing.
Speaking of investments, you're part of the largest investment in private sector investment in Canadian history at LNG Canada. If I go back 10 years, pretty well every major energy company in the world was in Northwest BC with a project. Exxon, Imperial, Nexen, BG, Petronas, missing about 10 others. Yet LNG Canada was the only one that weaved its way through to FID. Why were you guys the last one standing when everyone else vacated the field, do you think?
Yeah, I think part of the reason we were the last one standing is because we actually took a lot away from projects that didn't make it. And it wasn't necessarily LNG, it was pipelines, things like that didn't do enough to kind of get the license to proceed. And so for us, when we took the LNG Canada project forward and we started it, again, part of it is a relationship we built with First Nations in the jurisdiction, where we actually found a way to work together, that their interests were represented in the development of the project. And that actually helped us get through the environmental permitting cycle too, because there was this great integration of First Nations interests with our interests. And at the same time, I think we had a pretty good relationship with the provincial government working with the federal government in a substitute environmental regulatory review, which also helped move the project forward from that perspective. The other thing too, though, that I think really helped is, even though I would also say it's a very complex arrangement, the joint venture partnership between Shell, now Petronas, Mitsubishi Corporation, Korea Gas, and CNPC, which is actually China National Petroleum Company, was one where we're all involved in the production of natural gas in the upstream. We all would pay a toll in the pipeline to get the gas to the terminal. We're all partners in that terminal, but then we also all have a marketing arm. And some of them are even consumers. So when you look across that full value chain, you have parties that are involved across all of it. So we have an understanding of how that all needs to work together. And I think that set us up for more success of knowing, okay, well, if we can produce the LNG, we have a market to sell it to because we have the marketing arms. So the partnership itself, I think, was really helpful to that. I think the other thing too, and I think it was just the fact that it was, a group of people and companies that came together that actually really wanted to do it right and understand BC. We were based here. I'm still here. I mean, people say, wait, you're the head of Shell Canada, why are you here? No, my family's here, I live here, I want to be here. But it's really important. I've advised a lot of colleagues in Alberta that if you want to build a project in BC, you've got to be in BC. And I think that's truly important. And I used to make this joke quite a lot. When you open up the newspaper and you read about the oil and gas sector in Vancouver, you don't hear a lot of good things. Whereas if you open up the newspaper in Calgary and you read about the oil and gas sector, you're like, oh, why are we so misunderstood? And so it's really important to understand the culture and the context. And I think for us, I think the company did a pretty good job. But I would also say this last thing, the community relationships that were built. And I actually believe in this construct or this principle that all politics is local, which is by Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House. Relationships start locally. And you got to build the relationships. You've got to actually be able to sit at the table and understand what makes people interested in this. What do they care about? And if you start with that, well, then you can go forward from there.
That builds on, I think I read a comment from you about how public relations used to be something that came in at the tail end of a large energy project. And now we've shifted into a context where it's involved right up front. Is that, can you explain more of what you mean and how?
Well, we use this term in our industry called front-end engineering. And so that's really about how much do we design of a project, technically mostly, in the front end of it. Well, I actually call it front-end social engineering. How much do we understand the community interests? How much do we understand what makes this project acceptable to them right at the front end? Because if there is no pathway of making it acceptable, well, then let's not wait to the back end to figure it out. So I actually think we have to spend quite a bit of time right up front saying, is this going to be a project that can actually grow with the community can feel comfortable with? And when we look at the actual structure, back to the earlier question from Mike about why did we work, I think we took that pretty seriously. And we took it seriously both from the community of Kitimat's perspective, terrorists, but also Indigenous and First Nations. And we said, okay, well, how do we make sure that this becomes a part of the plan right in the beginning? And it's not an afterthought. And so then we can build it into the plan. Everything from the design of the facility itself, how we would avoid these particular areas or how we would elevate these lines, that came from a result of Indigenous engagement. And these are major, expensive technical decisions that we make because of that feedback. And so that's really, really important. I think companies that fail to do that will find themselves finding their projects much more expensive and much more challenged.
In the few minutes we have remaining, Susannah, I wanted to switch gears here and ask you about your work with Covenant House and human trafficking. I noticed that you had an announcement not too long ago with Lieutenant Governor Janet Austin, and that's going to let you get on your soapbox and tell us about it.
Yes. Well, just a few moments on this one. It's shocking to many that human trafficking is one of the fastest growing crimes in Canada, and frankly happens quite a bit here in British Columbia and Vancouver even. You're like, what? This can't happen here. That's not an international thing. People get trafficked all over the world, but not here. Well, no, it happens here. It happens here quite a lot, actually. And when I was, working on a variety of different projects, I became more familiar with it. In particular, in working on projects where there were a lot of Indigenous interests, but then certainly the history around the Highway of Tears, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And when I left the LNG Canada project, I said to myself, I'm coming into a new role. It's one thing for me to just do this role, but I actually think as corporate leaders, we have to show up and put, our fingers on projects and social issues that are really important. And this one hit me directly because of the amount of Indigenous women and girls that I worked with, because I've been to various places where I've looked at the recovery of people who've been trafficked. And it's interesting because I remember when I first became familiar with the issue, Paul Brandt, who's a country singer of Alberta, he created a foundation called Not in My City. And Not in My City is all about raising awareness on human trafficking. And he and I became friends as I began to understand it more. And then I began to say, well, what can I do? I was shocked and surprised by this. I'm raising awareness in my company. I'm working with partners like Paul. I'm going to make sure, and we are essentially putting in all of our retail stations numbers for people who are potentially trafficked to call hotlines. What can I ask the rest of corporate leaders to do in this space? And so working with the Lieutenant Governor, Janet Austin, who immediately said, no problem, I'll partner with you on this. And then organizations like Covenant House, we had an event a couple months ago, which was really to bring together other corporate leaders to say, not in my city, or what can we do to raise awareness so we can prevent and act on this. So that's what we've done. And we created the BC Network for the Prevention of Human Trafficking. And this really is about how do we leverage a lot of the good work of many organizations that are already here to make sure we're more coordinated. If I come back to that systems approach on the energy transition, a lot of our social issues have the same systemic problem. We think by throwing money at one part of it that we are actually solving the social issue. We're not. We've got to look across the entire system. So in trafficking, how are people essentially getting groomed into it? Once they're into it, how do you help them get out? Once you have people who've been trafficked, who are traffickers, how do you bring them to justice? And then so there's a full value chain and systems approach to social issues. And on human trafficking, my goal is to create that value chain so we have all of these organizations working more effectively together. And so we can actually have a real outsized impact on it.
Fantastic. Well,
thanks for joining.
I was going to say, thanks for joining us today. I was going to say, well, if you ever want to walk to Burnaby with me, let me know. It only takes about 4 or 5 hours, but we appreciate
it's beautiful in Burnaby. I'm glad. I hope it was a sunny day too.
Especially, yeah. But thanks for joining us today, sharing your valuable time with us, and it was very insightful.
Great, Kate, Mike, thanks so much. Good to see you.
Last week, I was talking about those cold snaps, when we really need energy to keep us warm and cozy. But it's not just a matter of cranking up the thermostat. It's also about using energy more efficiently. Our sponsor, FortisBC, recently announced it will invest a record $695.8 million to help its customers reduce their energy use over the next 4 years. It's a key pillar in the company's goal to lead the clean energy transformation in BC and reduce consumers' energy use, not to mention bringing down energy costs for consumers and businesses. Efficiency measures make a ton of difference. 740,000 tons, in fact. That's how many tons of CO2 emissions will be reduced over the life of these measures, equivalent to taking more than 228,000 passenger cars off the road. Don't worry, my car's in the garage. I walk to work. These measures are all part of FortisBC's Clean Growth Pathway to 2050, and an important contribution to helping Canada meet its pledge to double energy efficiency by 2030. Hotel Pacifico's window to the world is triple paned, and FortisBC is there to help. Energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Okay, welcome back to the Strategy Suite. Good to see you, Geoff.
Good to see you all.
Good.
Great conversation with Susannah Pierce.
Yeah, really interesting. And actually, we're going to we'll volley off of that conversation and start with April 1st. Along with the Easter eggs came a hike in the cost of carbon of about $15 per ton, or if you're in BC, 3.3 cents on the liter of gasoline. I'm sure out east they were enjoying an affordably cozy holiday weekend in their homes heated by oil. But Mike, do you think this came and went without people noticing, or do you think all the bluster from Polyev, which has been conspicuously aimed at EV, was well placed?
I think people noticed. I was in the barber shop on the weekend. I know that may surprise many people that I am actually go to a barber, that I need a barber. Well, sometimes gotta get it tidied up there.
Looks
great.
But
the two barbers in there were chit-chatting with each other, two small business people, and just they're talking about April 1st, talking about the carbon tax, talking about the price at the pump. And I think those types of conversations were happening everywhere. I think Polyev has driven this issue considerably at a national level and into a pretty big conversation point. I think he's driving it much more than the provincial politicians are. But it's the same effect in terms of it being top of mind for people, because it hasn't really the federal Liberals have belatedly challenged the narrative, and Jonathan Wilkinson's been waving his fist at Polyev in the last few days, but to me that's not really the level of emotional response that was required at the federal level, and so I think will this fade off a bit now in the coming weeks? We'll see.
We'll see.
But the frustrating part is that, and I'm not as close to gas price watcher as I used to be, but I think it's true to say in the last couple of weeks, the cost of gas went up 15 cents a liter. In fact, in the last week or so, it went up about 15 cents, of which only 3 cents is carbon tax. And the people who always get a get out of jail free card in this are the oil companies. And earlier you were talking about Parkland refinery, and we have very, very limited refining capacity here in BC. So we're especially vulnerable at the end of the supply chain to these changes. So there's legitimate reasons why the price goes up. But the conversation has shifted completely to the carbon tax. And so far in BC, where it's much more long-standing policy, I don't know whether it's going to bite as hard as it has in some of the other provinces, like New Brunswick, for example. Manitoba's skating along pretty carefully. We'll see about Ontario, but we have had carbon tax here for a long time.
Yeah. And to say too, there were protests, and roadblocks, I think, across the country. By far, Alberta had the biggest of anywhere. I'm curious, Geoff, have you noticed, because I do think Poilievre on this issue really has decided that his opponent is David Eby. What's his thinking there? And is there an advantage for him in that? Certainly, Eby landed the good baloney line.
There's certainly huge gains to be made by the federal Conservatives if they continue on the track they're on here in BC. And we can debate how much that's lifting John Rustad's boat, but clearly Poilievre's doing very, very well. And he has a good possibility, if it continues in this road, of getting 5 or 6 seats from New Democrats. And the most high-profile New Democrat in BC is David Eby, who has said he will be maintaining the carbon tax. And I think it's an interesting debate because there is a Clean BC plan. It's been broadly supported. It was a crucial part of the minority government that was formed by John Horgan with the Green Party, then led by Andrew Weaver. And that whole plan discussion seems to have gone to the background, but it has many, many features in it, including one, which the Parkland refinery, and Mike went by there on his walk, has been making significant investments to reduce the carbon content of gasoline. And it's a major contributor to emissions reductions here in this province. So I'm interested to see how much climate and resilience in the face of the oncoming drought become part of the political debate, and how much carbon tax continues to dominate.
Yeah, and I wonder too, the other interesting thing is there's a bit of a difference in how the tax is applied in BC compared to the rest of the country. And I think, I was funny because I was looking up again, over the weekend with this shift, what the rebates are for everybody, right? It's based on the size of your family. If you're in the federal plan, and then in BC, it's income tested. And, families of 4 are seeing some quarterly pretty sizable checks, in other provinces. In BC, what is it? What 1/3 of residents are not eligible for the rebate? Is that right, Geoff?
Well, it's income tested. It's income tested.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's hard to argue that someone who's driving a very large vehicle in the city really needs a lot of help on their fuel costs when there's transit options. The problem politically comes in the interior and places like that where there is literally no option, and an electric car is not going to get you around in the wintertime. And I think that's a legitimate concern that's going to have to be confronted. Exactly.
All right, so then this week too, I'm going to move us because we have a clipping. Rob Shaw and Business in Vancouver on the Haida Decision, the landmark agreement between the government and the Haida Nation, affirming Haida title over the highlands of Haida Gwaii. Rob sets out what he sees as a strong case for the agreement, but laments, and this is a fantastic use of sort of a triple-barreled hyphenated adjective, shout out Rob for that, overstaffed, high-priced, hyper-partisan army of BC government communications people who he says haven't done the work on consultation and building support. Basically, just falling back on calling the critics racist. He also calls it, the other kind of good hyper-partisan spin tornado is what he's saying has resulted. And Rob's saying, the government needs to hold back on this legislation until after the election. Do you think that's fair, Geoff?
Well, I don't see the reaction, and I watch pretty closely. I don't see anywhere close to the reaction on this that came with the Land Act, which was walked back. And I think the reason for that is that the debate in Haida Gwaii has been going on for more than a generation. It's been going on for, more than 100 years from a Haida perspective. but the people in Haida are very alive to it. One of the last events I got to attend in my old job with John Horgan was the renaming of Queen Charlotte City to Dajin which was not without controversy, but the majority population on Haida now are members of the Haida Nation. And I think the title case there is so obvious, it's difficult to see why you would delay it or pursue it any further. So what's been done here makes perfect sense, I think, to most people. And I haven't seen the controversy arrive around it that Rob Shaw points to with regard to the Land Act, but maybe I'm just not paying attention. I think it's a good thing to do, and it should be done.
Yeah.
The government should stay the course.
Well, I think it's interesting that I got that kind of reaction out of Rob Shaw, because Rob Shaw doesn't strike me as a journalist who's got an axe to grind on First Nation issues. I think this is an issue of how government's handling media relations and information around this very significant announcement, which is complicated. And arguably, I think this point Rob's making is that ought to be a little more sunshine on this thing so that people have a bit more understanding of what it's all about and what it might mean for them or not mean for them. So, that's where I see a similarity in the Land Act, is that there's a theme perhaps developing here that the government's not being as proactive as it could be in conditioning these issues with the public. I agree with you. I agree with you that it's not landed as politically explosively as the Land Act.
Well, I just think that it's been so long coming in the Haida case that it really highlights the shortcomings which were acknowledged by the government in the Land Act issue. But I just want to say, and both you and I have been in this chair, Mike, receiving criticism from the press gallery for hyperpartisan spin tornadoes. And I just want to say to the people in those jobs, don't worry, you're doing fine. I think it's all going to be fine.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
He said high-priced, hyperpartisan.
Overstaffed.
Did you guys increase salaries over there?
I know.
I was being that high-priced.
I was going to say, Rob, let me tell you a bit about salaries in other provinces and actually how ministers are staffed in particular.
Well, we know how tough it is at Post Media, and we have to spare a thought for Rob on that front.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, he's not Post Media anymore. He's not Post Media anymore. He's
it's Glacier.
Well, Rob is actually, and just we'll talk about Rob for a second here, since he's such a big presence in the gallery. He's kind of had to reinvent himself as a journalist. He's got, I think, Daily Hive. He's got Glacier. And he's got Check 6 as well. So
I'd like to make a preemptive apology to Rob for putting him back at Post Media.
We will all like to apologize for Geoff.
Yeah. And we're glad to see Rob on.
I'm just going to take time out in Kingfisher, Mike.
But enough about Rob Shaw. Seriously.
Well, we should let's move to nominations, because it's been continues to be an interesting time in nominations. I want to start with the BC Conservatives had 2 candidates they had to dump. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, one this week, and then there was one the previous week or something like that.
Week, right.
Yeah.
So one's
both on the island.
Okay, but one's Ladysmith Oceanside. That's your turf, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, first of all, this is I might have said this once before on the podcast. This is the stupidest riding that a boundaries commission has ever designed. I cannot believe it made it through the process. Ladysmith Oceanside, which is basically Ladysmith, then a bunch of trees, and then Parksville. And then
so
it has the 2 communities have it's like calling a riding, Coquitlam, Nanaimo.
I recall Nanaimo's
Okay.
Anyways.
Okay, heard.
So boundaries commission, noted. You blew that one.
Mm-hmm. Shot. You should have said that for the shot.
Well, I can't wait.
No extra shots.
So offended by this riding.
That bad. Okay.
Good people of Ladysmith have been displaced.
But that's the one where they had to pull the physician who was saying vaccines make you magnetized, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Very magnetic personality.
Like not in the good way though. I feel like there's a bad version.
In the bad way.
In the bad way. Well, when he said that vaccine could magnetize you, he crossed the line. He was just anti-vax. That was all right.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think that's it.
You bring magnetism into this. That's a whole nother story.
This is the problem, because I think the Conservatives have courted this anti-vaccine mandate space, and I think are trying to court a space that is about the mandate part, not so much the conspiracy theories about the vaccines. Fair, and I think both these candidates, the other one's Esquimalt Colwood, Yeah, I think
Esquimalt, did you say?
Esquimalt.
Esquimalt. Oh my God.
My Ontario comes out sometimes. Shit.
Yeah.
Esquimalt Coed. Well, at least I know where Kingfisher is. So also ventured into this space of saying vaccines would hurt other people around you potentially, I think was what she said. So those are two down. And then, okay, let's talk then
Yeah,
a
so
little bit. Yeah.
the conservative spokesman said something along the lines of, well, we're a growing party and these things happen, which I thought was probably the best line for the occasion, which
Yeah.
has the advantage of being true,
Yeah.
is that they're probably flying by the seat of their pants and throwing people onto the ballot in this shadow race with BC United over who can have more candidates faster. Just go find them wherever you can and throw them on the ballot and get your numbers up. And that's what you get. You get, when you don't do due diligence enough, you get magnetic candidates.
In the bad way. That way. Okay. And then moving on to, I think, we've talked about this one before, but Little Mountain and the race for the nomination between Andrea Reimer and Christine Boyle. I know on the kind of endorsement side, I think Andrea seems to be ahead, but I hear Geoff that Christine had a pretty conspicuous endorsement recently.
Yeah, and to be clear, I've been a longtime friend of Andrea, and I'm supporting Andrea. I don't get to vote, but I certainly think she's a superb candidate, and that's not a knock on Christine. Christine Boyle has been working hard. The race is just about over. Advanced voting was on the weekend, and I understand it was quite heavy. There's not a lot of members. The party decided not to have a long race here. And as a result, the vote is April 4th. So this week, we're going to find out who's successful in that race. And certainly in terms of endorsements, Andrea went in with a very strong support, full on from George Heyman, the incumbent MLA, who she'd been working with for a number of years on the riding executive as and head of his EPC. And she's lived in the riding. Christine is also, I should say, Andrea's had endorsements from other MLAs former MLAs like Melanie Mark, and she had an endorsement from Grand Chief Stuart Phillips, so a very diverse, broad group. But also, I think most critically, two or three people who our listeners won't know at all, but who are longtime members and activists in the constituency itself. On Christine's side, though, as you mentioned, there was a remarkable letter she sent around to a number of constituents, which I saw a copy of, from Kaylee Lynch, who, of course, is married to the Premier, David Eby. And she and Christine Boyle are old friends. And while Kaylee emphasized that she was not speaking for the Premier, she was certainly speaking in favor of Christine Boyle. And people may remember that Kaylee spoke at the convention, the NDP convention in November, and even by the Premier's standards, pretty much upstaged him. She's very capable politically and gave very strong remarks on that occasion. So she's clearly politically active, and we'll see how her endorsement plays out for Christine Boyle in a few days, very soon.
Yeah, like next time we talk, we'll get to reflect on this one.
That's really interesting to have a Premier's spouse wade into a nomination campaign. It's a free country, and I think there's probably an elevated sense of understanding about spouses having their right to their own opinions and that kind of thing. But still, it's not, you don't see it very often. Let's put it that way.
Well, and I think, Mike, to your point, the reason is that nomination races are divisive. And so it's tricky for a Premier to be associated with these kinds of races, even though presumably he's an old friend of Christine Boyle too. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but I think it's the case. So we'll see how that goes. But certainly George Heyman had always indicated, this was well known for several years, that at the point at which he decided to step down, he was hopeful that Andrew would be successful. So his endorsement is not a surprise, but we may not see endorsements. I doubt we'll see endorsements from other MLAs, even if they roll in who's coming up. So in a quick thumbnail, there are a bunch of nomination meetings going to be announced by the NDP in the coming weeks, and contests, and some of the vacancies we already know about, including Cowichan, where there's an opportunity there for a man to run, because there's no gender equity policy there, because that's Sonia Furstenow's old seat. So there'll be a race there. The Sunshine Coast, where Nick Simons is not running again or offering again. Also, a couple of others, but I think we'll see races as well in places where normally New Democrats have had to go looking for a candidate, including Kelowna even, where there's apparently a race shaping up there. Yaletown, which is a new riding without an incumbent, very going to be hotly contested, and also even Kamloops. So lots of interest in NDP nominations this time.
And those are going to happen in the spring?
Yeah, apparently
Probably.
quite soon. Yeah, before full-on summer, so we'll get a chance to get busy. But I guess these folks are already signing up, so these will be not snap votes. They will be, against a backdrop of people in the field looking for signups for a period of time.
So get these nominations in just before the spring election.
Oh,
we did that piece already. We did that. That was last week.
For the rumor. Yeah.
Oh, that was last week. Oh,
yeah. I heard that rumor actually earlier this morning, and I was like, did we start that? All right,
we didn't start it. We just spread it.
Do we fuel it? Potentially guilty. All right. Well, with that, then we need a drink.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
Well, I am going to take a shot. I don't like taking shots at staff people, so I won't name him. But I'm going to take a shot at BC United Communications for a quote in a story on the Polyev effect on BC politics. And the quote is that the BC Conservatives are a quote-unquote non-serious party who received 1.91% of the vote in 2020 with no affiliation to the Federal Conservative Party. Well, certainly the no affiliation to the Federal Conservative Party is true, but it doesn't sound very humble to me. And guess what? They're polling at more than 1.91% of the vote now, and that seems to me to be pretty serious. So, did not like the messaging on that, and I think got to take that head on and not think that people are going to not support the Conservatives because they look insignificant. That's not the situation right now. So anyways, that's my shot.
Yeah, completely agree. They need I go back to my minibar from last year. It's like you're managing the ex-boyfriend. You got to bring class in how you talk to him. All right, Geoff, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to raise a toast to, I guess I'll do it to Kelly Green, who's the MLA for Richmond-Steveston, for a decision that she was very disappointed in, made by the government. Her riding includes the location of, includes Tilbury Island, where there is a small LNG facility run by Fortis BC, of course, also a sponsor of this podcast, but that's not why I'm raising it, who recently got an EA approval to do a jetty, it's called. It's a place where people can put LNG onto small vessels, which will then be used to fuel much larger vessels. And I've always thought of all of the LNG projects that were floating around, this was one of the most meritorious because large seagoing vessels are big emitters and they use heavy bunker fuel, which they're now required to get off of. And the most practical opportunity for them is to move to LNG, which is why we see it on our ferries. The other great thing about this is we can actually count the reductions right here in our own economy, as opposed to worrying about whether or not China's closing down a coal plant and that kind of thing. So for a whole set of reasons, I always thought that this was a good idea and was not sure why it was proving so difficult to put across. There were concerns in Richmond. Kelly Green has said she's disappointed in the decision, but she's going to offer again in the next election. So a toast to her. This must be tough for her personally, but I think it's a good thing for the province generally. And I was interested to see it all happen. So that's my toast.
Nice. All right. Well, I'm going to finish this off with a shot. It's one of those shots too. It's a shot at Mitzi Dean, and it's done with a bit of a, I want to do that eye thing. Look, I'm hear what I'm saying here, because I am deeply concerned about the unspent federal money for childcare. It's a little north of 600 million, I believe. And I'm deeply concerned about it actually, not even just from a sort of policy perspective. I'm going to say this is a look you cannot pull off right now. You cannot pull off this look right now in the context of being off on the targets for $10 a day childcare, having deficit, having posted a large record-breaking deficit. Having this money sit around is the biggest liability. It's an albatross. It's a problem. And And I know a lot about the challenges of spending that money and sort of the funny alchemy of, actually, it relates to our discussion with Susannah about like how you have to kind of complement different pieces of spending on the policy in childcare. And in operational funding, there's actually a lot of opportunity. And you got to get out the door like fast. This is not tenable, promise
Are you
you.
saying they're holding childcare dollars hostage?
Okay. It's maybe not a hostage situation, but like the childcare dollars are like over for dinner and they're trying to leave and they won't let them out. Like it's like a little bit like just like an uncomfortable too long anecdote around the dinner table type situation. It's not that bad. They're not hostage, but they need to get out. All right. And that's the shot for me. Yeah. On that note, I'm now I'm curious. I feel like we're taking more shots as the show goes on and doing less raising our glasses. Are we getting curmudgeonly, I think, as we age in this podcast?
I was all upbeat today. I was all upbeat.
Yeah. Okay. Jeff's the upbeat one today. Mike and I are the grumps.
Can't you tell all the positive energy comes from Geoff?
I love it. I love it.
From time to time.
Well, thanks again, both. It's lovely to see you for another good and lovely to chat with you on all of this for another great episode. Thanks to our listeners for joining us. Thanks for our guest, Susannah Pierce, for joining us. And thanks to our sponsors, TELUS and Fortis BC. We'll see you next week, ghosts. Yes, BC, you can never leave. I don't know why I'm calling our guests ghosts. That's terrible. It's like the hotel's haunted.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.